The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
Imagine 50,000 people standing in an open field. No microphone. No speaker system. No stadium roof to echo sound. Just one man, 24 years old, standing on a small mount of earth under an open sky, and every single one of those 50,000 people can hear every word he says. The year is 1739. England is morally rotting from the inside out. The churches are cold, the ministers are spiritually dead, and millions of souls are careening toward eternity without a single candle of hope to guide them. Then God raises up one voice. One burning, blazing, heaven-sent voice. And when that voice opens its mouth, nations tremble. This is the story of George Whitefield, the man history has nearly forgotten, but heaven has never stopped celebrating. He was born in 1714 in Gloucester, England, inside a busy inn called the Bell. His father, Thomas Whitefield, ran one of the finest hostelries in all that part of England. The family was prosperous, prominent, and comfortable. It seemed like George was born into a life of ease. But when George was only 2 years old, his father died. His mother, Elizabeth, took over the inn and kept the family afloat, but the warmth of a father's hand was gone from young George's life forever. From the very beginning, something unusual stirred inside this boy. He was drawn, inexplicably, irresistibly drawn, to the idea of becoming a minister. As a small child, when other boys were playing in the streets of Gloucester, George was in his room imitating the ministers he had watched reading prayers. He would gather his friends and play-act church services. He performed speeches before the city council when his school was visited by civic leaders. His teachers recognized that there was something extraordinary in this boy's mouth, a native eloquence that could not be taught. It could only be given by God. Yet George was no saint in those early years. He would be the first to tell you that himself. In the account he later wrote of his childhood, he described himself as one deeply addicted to lying, foolish talking, breaking the Sabbath, gambling with cards, reading vain romances, and on more than one occasion stealing money from his own mother. He ran into church services to shout the name of the pastor mockingly. He spent money on plays when he ought to have been studying. He was, in his own words, brutish from his mother's womb. But even in those years of darkness, there were strange whispers of grace. He later remembered retreating to his room during moments of conviction, kneeling with tears, and praying quietly. He would take portions of the money he stole and give it secretly to the poor. God was tracking this young man. God's hand was already on him, even before he knew it. When George was 15, poverty struck the Whitefield home in a new way. His mother had remarried, a man named Capel Longden, and it proved to be an unhappy match. Longden pushed himself into management of the inn, and the business began to decline sharply. The comfortable upper-middle-class life of the Whitefields crumbled. George, watching his mother struggle, made the heartbreaking decision to leave school and work in the inn himself. He put on his blue apron and became a common drawer, a servant, serving food and drink to guests. He would later say, "Seeing the boys go by to school has often cut me to the heart." But even in those dark days, he composed sermons in the evenings, still holding on to the dream that one day he would stand in a pulpit. Then a door opened. A young man told George's mother that it was possible to attend Oxford University at very little cost by entering as a servitor, a student who performed menial tasks for wealthier students in exchange for tuition and lodging. His mother wept with joy. George leapt at the opportunity. He returned to school, studied intensely, fasted during Lent, read his Greek New Testament daily, and in the autumn of 1732, George Whitefield entered Pembroke College, Oxford. Life as a servitor was humbling. He waited on the sons of wealthy gentlemen, carried their things, and did the work of a servant. But George performed his duties faithfully, and he said that having grown up in a public house had only made him better at it. He held tightly to his religious practices, spending long hours in prayer and study, even as fellow students mocked him and tried to pull him into their revelries. On one bitter cold night, rather than join his roommates in their excess, he sat alone in his study until his limbs were so numb from the cold he could barely sleep. Yet he held firm. And when his companions saw they could not move him, they left him alone, calling him a singular, odd fellow. And then came the day that would redirect the course of his eternal soul. George had been in Oxford about a year when Charles Wesley, one of the members of a small group of exceptionally devout students known as the Holy Club, mockingly called Bible moths, Bible bigots, and Methodists by their peers, heard that Whitefield was earnest in religion. Charles invited him to breakfast. It was an invitation that would change history. In that meeting, Whitefield was introduced to the Holy Club, a band of young men who rose early for long devotions, fasted twice a week, visited Oxford's prisons to minister to inmates, took the sacrament every Sunday, and lived with rigorous self-discipline. Their moderator was Charles's older brother, John Wesley, whose powerful presence shaped the entire group. And George Whitefield, the innkeeper's son from Gloucester, joined them with wholehearted zeal. In his pursuit of God through the Holy Club, Whitefield read a book that shattered everything he thought he knew about salvation. The book was written by a Scotsman, Henry Scougal, and it was titled The Life of God in the Soul of Man. What Whitefield read in its pages stopped him cold. He had assumed, as most people of his day assumed, that doing good works, attending church, receiving the sacrament, saying prayers, practicing discipline, was the path to heaven. But this book declared that true Christianity was something else entirely. It was a union of the soul with God. It was Christ formed within the heart. And Whitefield held that book in his trembling hands and cried out to God, "Lord, if I am not a Christian, or if not a real one, for Jesus Christ's sake show me what Christianity is, that I may not be damned at last." That prayer launched him into one of the most agonizing seasons of his life. He began a frantic search for the life of God, but the more he sought it through his own efforts, the more it eluded him. He gave up eating fruits and sweets. He wore a patched gown and dirty shoes as acts of self-denial. He adopted the practices of a group called the Quietists, refusing to speak unless absolutely necessary. He left off attending the Holy Club, thinking that perhaps his affection for his friends was an idol standing between him and God. His health collapsed. His academic work crumbled. His tutor feared he was going mad. He went into Christ Church Walk at night and lay flat on his face in the open field, praying in the cold and the dark for hours. Throughout the weeks of Lent one particular year, he restricted himself to coarse bread and sage tea without sugar. He wrote out lists of his sins every morning and every evening and confessed them before God. He prayed with strong cryings and tears, reading his Greek New Testament with desperate, shaking hands. By Passion Week, he was too weak even to creep upstairs. A physician confined him to bed. For 7 weeks he lay there, spent and hollow. And it was there, in utter weakness, in total bankruptcy of self-effort, in the absolute emptiness of a man who had tried everything and found nothing, that God came. Whitefield later testified, "God was pleased to remove the heavy load, to enable me to lay hold of his dear Son by a living faith, and by giving me the spirit of adoption, to seal me, even to the day of everlasting redemption. Oh, with what joy, joy unspeakable, even joy that was full of and big with glory, was my soul filled when the weight of sin went off, and an abiding sense of the love of God broke in upon my disconsolate soul." He was 20 years old. And he was a new creation. The transformation was immediate and total. He fell to writing letters to every brother, every sister, every friend, telling them what God had done for his soul. The gloom that had covered his life for months was gone completely. He found a new, ravishing delight in reading the Bible. He would kneel before it in the early hours of the morning, reading in English, studying in Greek, praying over every line, every word, feasting until its meaning became part of the marrow of his bones. He also began to witness boldly to people around him in Gloucester, and a small group gathered, the first Methodist society in the permanent sense of the word. It would remain connected to his ministry for the rest of his life. Now he faced the question of ordination. Since boyhood he had wanted to be a minister, but now that he truly knew God, the weight of that calling terrified him. He went to a room in Gloucester, knelt on the floor, and pleaded with God, "Lord, I cannot go. I shall be puffed up with pride and fall into the snare of the devil." He prayed 1,000 times, he said, until sweat fell from his face like rain, begging God not to let him enter the church until he was truly called. But the signs kept coming. Money arrived from unexpected sources to fund his return to Oxford. He graduated with his bachelor's degree. And the Bishop of Gloucester, Dr. Benson, one of England's better prelates, recognized Whitefield's extraordinary ability and earnestness despite his being only 21, and agreed to ordain him. On June 20, 1736, in the magnificent Gloucester Cathedral, George Whitefield was ordained into the ministry of the Church of England. He preached his first sermon in the Church of St. Mary Delaware Crypt, the very church where he had been baptized as an infant, and the effect was staggering. The congregation was large. At first the sight of so many people silenced him. But then the fire came. He preached with authority. He preached with power. Some few mocked. But most were struck deeply. And afterwards, a complaint was made to the bishop that Whitefield had driven 15 people mad with that very first sermon. The worthy bishop reportedly replied that he hoped the madness would not be forgotten before the following Sunday. He was not yet 22 years old. He tried to escape the applause. The people in Gloucester grew too fond of him, he said, and on the third day after his first sermon's triumph, he turned from the adulation and went back to Oxford. He had one goal, to be first a saint and then a scholar. But Oxford would not keep him either. Within weeks he was asked to preach in London at the Tower of London Chapel. He went. He preached. Though some initially sneered at his youth, they soon grew serious, deeply attentive, and moved. He ministered there 2 months. Then came the news that changed the trajectory of his life. John Wesley, who had sailed to the new colony of Georgia in America, wrote back to England urging Whitefield to come and help in the mission. Whitefield prayed and considered. He felt he was not yet ready for the full weight of ministry in England. He reasoned that a period in Georgia would provide valuable experience. And since his ordination had been as a deacon, the first stage of Church of England ordination, he would eventually need to return to England for the second stage as a priest. The decision was not impulsive. It was prayed over, deliberated, and made with clear eyes. He would go to America. But first he would say his farewells. What happened during those farewell months stunned England. He went first to Bristol to say goodbye. He intended to stay a few weeks. But when he preached, the churches were instantly and overwhelmingly crowded. People pressed in from every corner. The windows became crowded with those who could not get inside. Steam from the breath of the congregation fell from the pillars like drops of rain. Many had to be turned away for lack of room. Persons of every denomination, Anglican, Baptist, Presbyterian, Independent, flocked to hear him. Large offers of money were made to entice him to remain in Bristol permanently. He refused them all. Then he went to London to wait for his ship. He discovered that his passage would be delayed by months. So he preached. And he preached. And he preached again. On a single Lord's Day he would preach 4 times to vast and deeply affected audiences, reading prayers 2 or 3 times, and walking 12 miles going back and forth between churches. He wrote in his journal, "I now preach generally 9 times a week." People began walking the streets of London with lanterns before dawn to arrive early enough for the morning services. Churches nearby, churches where Whitefield himself was not even preaching, were filled with overflow crowds who could not get to where he was. And those who did come were so deeply affected, he wrote, that they were like persons mourning for a firstborn child. The Duchess of Marlborough, who dominated English social life and was altogether a woman of the world, wrote to a friend, "God knows we all need mending and none more than myself. I now hope in my old days to obtain mercy from God." The highest nobility in England were flooding into his services, lords and ladies, earls and dukes, crowding into churches that had been half empty for decades. And this was the work of a young man of 23. He finally sailed for Georgia in December of 1737, praying as he boarded his vessel, "God give me a deep humility, a well-guided zeal, a burning love and a single eye, and then let men or devils do their worst." On the ship, he immediately set to work. The soldiers and sailors were a cursing, card-playing, scornful company. He went among them quietly at first, distributing food and medicine to the sick, visiting every person on board daily. He began a small catechism class, only 6 or 7 at first, but it grew to 20 within a week. He added Bible studies, sermon time, a choir. He walked the deck at night to talk one-on-one with the sailors. He sat in the steerage with the common men, reasoning with them about righteousness and eternity. By the time the ship docked at Gibraltar, the transformation on board was so visible it astonished everyone. Men who had been cursing and gambling weeks before now stood forward like children to say their catechism, read their Bibles, and attended morning and evening worship. When Whitefield left Gibraltar, grown sailors and soldiers came to him weeping, telling him what God had done for their souls, and pressing gifts into his hands. He arrived in Georgia in May of 1738. The colony was barely 6 years old. Though still weak from a fever that had nearly killed him on the voyage, he held his first service the very next morning at 5 o'clock. 17 adults and 25 children were present. Within days the number of his hearers was growing steadily. But what gripped his heart more than anything else in Georgia was the sight of orphan children, little ones left homeless by the deaths of settlers in that hard, young land. He made a decision. He would build them a home. He named it Bethesda, a Hebrew word meaning house of mercy. Before the building was even completed, he filled the largest house in Savannah with orphans, clothing them, feeding them, schooling them, teaching the girls to weave and sew, and teaching the boys carpentry and farming. He returned to England after 5 months to secure a charter and raise money for Bethesda. And England exploded. He had been gone less than a year, but now he had to face a different kind of battle, one that would wound him deeply. In his absence, the churches had increasingly been closed to him. Clergy who had tolerated him before now viewed him as a dangerous fanatic. By the time he returned, 5 churches had already denied him permission to preach. The opposition was hardening. And it was in this moment, confronted by the closing of institutional doors, that George Whitefield did something that would change Christian history forever. He went outside. The idea had been forming in him partly through correspondence with a tireless Welsh evangelist, Howell Harris, who had been declaring the gospel at fairs and sporting events, standing on horse blocks, stone walls, and street tables, reaching people the churches would never reach. Whitefield considered it. He mentioned it to friends. They looked upon it as a mad notion. But they got on their knees together and prayed that nothing be done rashly. Then on a cold February Saturday in 1739, Whitefield walked into Kingswood, a large coal mining district adjacent to Bristol. No church had ever been built for these miners. No school, no minister, no one who cared. They were rough, hardened, and completely unchurched. Outsiders feared to enter their district. On occasions they had stormed into Bristol in violent mobs. George Whitefield walked in alone, visiting hut to hut, inviting people to gather. He climbed a small mound of earth. He opened his mouth. 200 people came. He went back on Wednesday. 2,000 came. He went back on Friday. 4,000. The following Sunday, after preaching in a church at 6 in the morning and again at 8 and again at 10, he went back to Kingswood in the late afternoon. 10,000 people stood in the open air, filling the trees and hedges as far as the eye could see. He preached for an hour with such power that everyone present, he was told, could hear every word. He came home that evening, he wrote, rejoicing at the great things God had done for my soul. And then came the sight that broke him open with holy wonder. As the miners came up out of their coal pits, their faces black with soot, something began to happen. White gutters began to appear on those dark faces, channels cut through the grime not by water, but by tears. Men who had never heard the gospel, who had never been inside a church, who had never in their lives been told that God loved them, were weeping. Hundreds of them. Whitefield wrote, having no righteousness of their own to renounce, They were glad to hear of a Jesus who was a friend of publicans and sinners, and came not to call the righteous but sinners to repentance. Those white tear tracks on black faces became one of the most celebrated images of the entire revival. He had broken the ice. And there was no going back. He moved the open-air ministry to London, first to Moorfields, a notorious park filled with vice and idleness, where a vast, seething crowd had gathered expecting God knows what. Men had warned him he would never come out of Moorfields alive. He walked in between two friends who were almost immediately separated from him by the crush of the crowd. He was carried forward by the mob, but instead of attacking him, the people formed a lane and carried him to the center of the field, where he preached without interruption to an exceedingly great multitude. That same evening he went to Kennington Common, a great open field where public hangings took place regularly, where vicious sports and drunken brawlings were the common entertainment. No fewer than 30,000 people were present. The wind carried his voice to the uttermost edges of the crowd. All stood in attentive silence. They joined in the psalm and in the Lord's Prayer. He wrote, "I scarce ever preached more quietly in a church." The word came with power. From that point, the numbers only grew. 20,000 at Moorfields on a Sunday morning. 50,000 at Kennington on a Sunday evening. Near 80 coaches, scores of horses, and a silence so profound that it felt like standing in the presence of eternity. On one occasion at Mayfair, near Hyde Park Corner, an estimated 80,000 gathered to hear him preach. Benjamin Franklin, who was not a man easily moved by religious enthusiasm, later conducted a careful scientific experiment to measure the range of Whitefield's voice. He calculated that Whitefield could be clearly heard and understood by more than 30,000 people at once. 30,000 people. Without a microphone. Without amplification of any kind. In the open air. Even if one reduced every estimate in Whitefield's journals by half, the numbers were still, as the historian Luke Tyerman put it, unique. No man in the history of the human voice had ever reached so many people. And yet the extraordinary thing was what these meetings did to those who attended them. This was not mere entertainment. This was not spectacle. People wept. People cried out to God. People who had lived in gross sin for decades fell under such conviction that they could not sleep. They came back the next morning. And the morning after that. Streets were filled before dawn with people carrying lanterns, making their way to wherever Whitefield would preach. Coachmen who had driven wealthy patrons to the services would call down from their seats, "Pray, sir, what must I do to be saved?" The poorest laborers and the most refined nobility were gripped equally by the same power. But Whitefield was a man, and the cost of such a ministry was written into his body. He preached 40 hours in a single week, often 60. He traveled constantly. He subsisted on little food and less sleep. He suffered recurrent illness that would leave a lesser man bedridden for months, yet he rose from his sickbed again and went immediately to the fields to preach. He once said, with the simplicity of a man utterly consumed, "I had rather wear out than rust out." Now it was time for him to sail for America on his second visit, and this time the crowds would not let him go in peace. At his farewell in London, all ranks of people wept and groaned. They ran to stop him in the alleys. They hugged him in the streets. They followed him with wishful, aching looks. A night of prayer and fasting was held. A communion service was conducted at which, he wrote, the tears of the communicants mingled with the cup. He boarded his vessel on the last day of December, 1737, and prayed that God would keep him humble. In America, something was already stirring. A holy trembling had begun to move through the colonies, and when Whitefield arrived it erupted into what history would remember as the Great Awakening, arguably the greatest movement of God in the history of the American continent. He preached in Philadelphia first, where the Presbyterian and Baptist pastors welcomed him and crowds gathered immediately in the open air. He preached in New York. He preached as he journeyed overland to Georgia, sleeping on the ground, nearly drowning while crossing the Potomac, declaring the gospel to handfuls in wilderness places and thousands in the towns. Benjamin Franklin described the effect. It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families in every street. Franklin also described his own experience of Whitefield's extraordinary power of persuasion when collecting for Bethesda. Having resolved not to give a single coin, Franklin sat through the sermon and felt something begin to soften in him. He moved from deciding to give the coppers in his pocket to the silver coins, and then at the sermon's end, as Whitefield reached his conclusion, Franklin emptied his entire pocket, gold and all, into the collection dish. "He finished so admirably," Franklin said, "that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all." Boston received Whitefield with trembling awe. Before dawn, long lines of people formed in the streets. Churches were crowded beyond anything their deacons had ever managed. At the Boston Common, Governor Belcher himself drove Whitefield to his farewell service in his personal carriage. The congregation assembled there, 23,000 strong, was larger than the entire population of the city of Boston. When Whitefield's ministry at the Common was finished, he declared, "I hope a glorious work is now begun." And it was. Pastors reported that people who had not given one thought to their souls in years were suddenly filled with overwhelming conviction. Tuesday evening prayer meetings began in Boston that would meet for years. Harvard College was transformed. Yale was shaken. One observer wrote of Yale, "The students in general became serious, many of them remarkably so." The voice of prayer and praise was heard in student chambers where previously only vanity had dwelt. And then came Northampton. Jonathan Edwards, the greatest theological mind in colonial America, a man of extraordinary depth and sobriety, had specifically written to invite Whitefield to his parish. When Whitefield came into his pulpit, Edwards wept throughout the entire sermon. The congregation wept with him. On the following afternoon, the power increased still more. Edwards's wife Sarah wrote to her brother in New Haven, "I have seen upward of 1,000 people hang on his words with breathless silence, broken only by an occasional half-suppressed sob. He impresses the ignorant, and not less the educated and refined. Our mechanics shut up their shops, and the day laborers throw down their tools to go and hear him preach, and few return unaffected." Across the length of New England, from town to town, the awakening spread like fire on dry ground. Nathan Cole, an unlettered Connecticut farmer, left a breathless account of the morning he heard a rider announce that Whitefield would preach at Middletown at 10 o'clock. Cole dropped his tools in the field, ran home, threw his wife on the saddle, and rode at full gallop, trading places with her when the horse tired, running himself until nearly breathless. And when they crested the hill above the river, they saw something that stopped them cold. A cloud on the road. A rumbling that grew louder as they approached. It was the sound of 1,000 horses' hooves, people from every direction pouring toward that field. Cole wrote, "When I saw Mr. Whitefield come up upon the scaffold, he looked almost angelical, a young, slim, slender youth before thousands of people, and with a bold, undaunted countenance, a sweet solemnity sat upon his brow. My old foundation was broken up, and I see my righteousness would not save me." That sentence, "My old foundation was broken up," could stand as the motto of the entire Great Awakening. But with the glory came also the suffering. The opposition against Whitefield was fierce and unrelenting from both sides of the Atlantic. In England, his old friend John Wesley, with whom Whitefield had been so deeply joined in the Oxford Holy Club and the early days of revival, had by now begun to promote theological positions that Whitefield believed were dangerously wrong. Wesley preached a sermon called "Free Grace" against the doctrine of election, the very doctrine that Whitefield had come to see as the bedrock of his assurance in God's sovereign love, and he published it widely. The wound this caused Whitefield was deep and personal. He had begged Wesley not to sow division. He had pleaded, he had written, he had wept. But Wesley pressed on. When Whitefield returned to England in 1741, much of what he had built had been shaken. His former followers, who had loved him so passionately, had been turned against him by Wesley's teaching. Men and women who had once wept at his departure now rushed past him in the street with their fingers in their ears, because Wesley had told them that to hear Whitefield was to hear heresy. The financial support for Bethesda's orphans had dried up. His publisher had become a Moravian and refused to sell any of his literature. His friend and patron William Seward, the first Methodist martyr, had been struck down by a mob in Wales and had died. And a debt of £350 that Seward had taken on for the orphan house now fell entirely on Whitefield's shoulders, with creditors threatening to have him imprisoned if he failed to pay. He wrote to Wesley with aching love, "My heart almost bleeds within me. Methinks I would be willing to tarry here on the waters forever rather than come to England to oppose you." And in his great letter of reply to Wesley's published sermon, he never once used a harsh word. He addressed Wesley always as, "My honored friend," and "honored sir." He was unmovable in his convictions. But he was never cruel, never bitter. And to those who urged him to claim his share of the buildings in Bristol that Wesley had effectively seized, he replied simply, "Let the name of Whitefield perish, but Christ be glorified." Those words echoed across eternity. Let the name of Whitefield perish, but Christ be glorified. Let my name die everywhere, let even my friends forget me, if by that means the cause of the blessed Jesus may be promoted. He was 26 years old when he said that. And then he did something so staggering, so contrary to the spirit of any ambitious man, that even his fiercest critics were silenced. At the height of his fame, when he was the most celebrated preacher in the English-speaking world, when his name was a household word on 2 continents, when thousands of people called themselves his followers and the Calvinistic Methodist Association named him its moderator for life, he voluntarily and deliberately surrendered it all. He announced that he would no longer serve as the head of Calvinistic Methodism. He gave up the position of leadership he had built. He freed himself of all organizational power. He did it so that John Wesley could be the recognized head of Methodism, so that the movement would not be torn apart by rivalry and strife. He did it so that Christ alone would be glorified. And in doing so, he ensured that history would remember Wesley as the founder of Methodism and largely forget Whitefield's immense role in building it. As one historian noted, Whitefield was the first organizer of Methodism, holding the first Methodist conference 18 months before Wesley held his. Yet Wesley receives the credit in almost every history book. Whitefield chose this outcome deliberately. Where in all of church history do we find such magnificent, self-annihilating humility? He said, "I care not who is uppermost. I know my place, even to be the servant of all. I am content to wait till the judgment day for the clearing up of my reputation." And so he became exactly that, the servant of all. He preached in Wesley's pulpits and praised Wesley's work to his own congregations. He preached for the Independents in New England, the Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies, the Baptists in the South. He crossed denominational lines not from carelessness about doctrine but from a consuming passion for souls. When Wesley fell gravely ill in 1753 and wrote his own epitaph, Whitefield wrote to him with tender, heartbroken love, "A radiant throne awaits you, and ere long you will enter into your Master's joy. May underneath you be Christ's everlasting arms." Wesley recovered, and there were nearly 40 more years of labor ahead of him. Whitefield meanwhile went on preaching. To Scotland, 13 visits in all, where the spiritual deadness of the prevailing moderate party in the church was shaken and great numbers turned to God. To Ireland, where in Dublin he preached to vast crowds in the open air, and where on one occasion after an outdoor service he was set upon by a mob of hundreds who pelted him from all sides with stones until he was reeling, almost breathless, covered in blood. He staggered to a minister's door. His friends found him speechless and panting. They washed his wounds, their own tears falling freely. He stayed 3 more weeks in Ireland. And when he left he said of his attackers, "I pray God I may thus be revenged of them," meaning he prayed that God would convert them. He nearly died at sea multiple times on his 13 Atlantic crossings. He endured the mockery of prominent actors who staged obscene plays caricaturing him in London's most fashionable theaters, plays with characters like Dr. Squintum, a mocking reference to the slight squint in his eye, that were performed repeatedly to howling, laughing crowds. He endured 3 anonymous assassination threats so serious that the King of England issued an official proclamation offering a reward for information about the perpetrators. He was beaten by officers in the night at his own lodgings, escaped imprisonment for debt only by miraculous provision, and suffered the grief of burying a young son, his only child, while in the midst of ministry, quoting scripture over the little grave and then going immediately to preach. Through it all, he maintained a character so consistently gracious, so utterly free from bitterness and self-seeking, that even his enemies were eventually disarmed. Howell Harris, who knew him as well as anyone, wrote, "I see the man to be all of one piece." It is truly a rare thing to see one so eminent for humility in the midst of applause, for meekness and patience under reproaches and injuries, for love to enemies, for desire to glorify Christ and save souls. It is rare to see in a man such a flaming fire for God in the pulpit, and yet most easy and calm when conversing with men out of it. All the while, Bethesda, the orphan house in Georgia, continued as the quiet heartbeat of his life. He built it, maintained it, fundraised for it across 2 continents, and poured his personal resources into it. He had no personal wealth. He made no purse for himself. What he received he gave away. When a Scottish woman of considerable wealth tried to give him her entire estate, he declined. His own wife at times lived in near poverty while he gave away what he had to others. He answered every charge of financial dishonesty with the only answer a holy man can give: a blameless life. Those who investigated found nothing. Those who knew him most intimately defended him with their lives. He preached to the poor and the rich alike, and God used him equally in both worlds. The coal miners of Kingswood and the slaves of America understood him perfectly. The sight of their tears on soot-blackened faces and their joy in finding a Jesus who was a friend of sinners remained one of the defining images of the revival. And simultaneously, in the elegant drawing rooms of Lady Huntingdon, the highest nobility of England, lords, dukes, earls, philosophers, generals, and members of Parliament, sat under his preaching and were broken. Lord Bolingbroke, one of the great intellects of England, declared after first hearing Whitefield that he had done great justice to the divine attributes. The Earl of Chesterfield, himself a celebrated orator, said, "Mr. Whitefield's eloquence is unrivaled, his zeal inexhaustible, and not to admire both would argue a total absence of taste." David Hume, the famous agnostic philosopher, said, "Mr. Whitefield is the most ingenious preacher I ever heard. It is worth going 20 miles to hear him." And then he described a moment when Whitefield, near the close of a sermon, described in the simplest possible language the dying love of Christ for sinners, and almost the entire assembly dissolved in tears. His final visit to America was his 7th, and he knew it was the last. He was 54 years old. His body had been burning for God for 3 decades, and the fire was nearly spent. He traveled his familiar circuits, but now the weariness showed on his face. People who had not seen him in years were startled by how he had aged. Yet when he opened his mouth to preach, something extraordinary still happened. The power came. The fire returned. They were not the crowds of his early years, but they were real, and the Holy Spirit moved among them as faithfully as ever. On the evening of September 29, 1770, in Exeter, New Hampshire, he was on his way through town and had no intention of stopping. But a great crowd had gathered in a field and a platform had been erected and the people would not let him pass. An elderly gentleman looked at him and said gently, "Sir, you are more fit to go to bed than to preach." Whitefield turned aside, looked up at the sky, and said quietly, "Lord Jesus, I am weary in thy work, but not weary of it. If I have not yet finished my course, let me go and speak for thee once more in the fields, seal thy truth, and come home and die." He mounted that platform. He stood silently for several minutes, unable to speak. Then he began. For 2 hours he preached, and those who heard him said it was perhaps the greatest sermon of his life. "I go," he cried, "I go to a rest prepared. My sun has arisen and by aid from heaven has given light to many. It is now about to set. No, it is about to rise to the zenith of eternal glory. Many may outlive me on earth, but they cannot outlive me in heaven. O thought divine! I shall soon be in a world where time, age, pain, and sorrow are unknown. My body fails, my spirit expands. How willingly would I live to preach Christ! But I die to be with him." He went that night to the home of the Reverend Jonathan Parsons in Newburyport. While the family was at supper, he said he was tired and would go to bed. He was on the staircase landing, candle in hand, when the door opened below him and a crowd pushed in from outside, earnestly begging him to preach just one more time. He stood on the landing with his candle and preached Christ to the crowd below him until the candle burned down in its socket and guttered out in the darkness. That candle was his life. He woke near 2 a.m, gasping for air. "A good pulpit sweat today may give me relief," he said. "I shall be better after preaching." His companion Richard Smith told him he wished he would not preach so often. Whitefield answered, "I had rather wear out than rust out." He rose again at 4, threw open the window and said, "I am almost suffocated. I can scarce breathe." And then, at 7 o'clock on the morning of Sunday, September 30th, 1770, George Whitefield ceased to breathe on this earth. He was 55 years old. He had preached 18,000 sermons. He had crossed the Atlantic 13 times. He had preached in every one of the American colonies. He had traversed England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. He had preached to more human beings than any man who had ever lived up to that point in history. He had built an orphan house in the American wilderness. He had never sought personal wealth, personal fame, or personal power. He had willingly surrendered every position and every title that could have been his. He had loved his enemies, blessed those who persecuted him, prayed for those who beat him, wept over those who hated him, and gone on preaching until the last candle burned out. John Wesley, who had been asked by Whitefield to preach his memorial service, stood in the tabernacle and in the chapel and paid tribute to this man who had willingly stepped aside so that Wesley could lead. He asked the crowded congregations, "Have we read or heard of any person who called so many thousands, so many myriads of sinners to repentance?" And the silence that answered him was itself a kind of answer. William Cowper, the poet, wrote of him, "He loved the world that hated him." The tear that dropped upon his Bible was sincere. Assailed by scandal and the tongue of strife, his only answer was a blameless life. And he that forged and he that threw the dart had each a brother's interest in his heart. Charles Wesley, who knew him perhaps more intimately than anyone still living, sat down after his friend's death and wrote 536 lines of elegy, the longest poem he ever dedicated to a single person. In it, he described the fire that had consumed Whitefield's life and the tenderness that had made that fire beautiful. Lover of all mankind, his life he gave, Christ to exalt, and precious souls to save. Nor age nor sickness could abate his zeal to feed the flock and serve the Master's will. Though spent with pain and toils that never ceased, he labored on, nor asked to be released. And so we stand at the end of a life that was, from its first breath to its last, an argument against comfort. George Whitefield never lived for ease. He never lived for recognition. He lived for one thing only, and that thing was the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ to every human being who would hold still long enough to hear it. He preached in cathedrals and coal pits, drawing rooms and open fields, prison cells and Harvard College chapels. He preached in cold and heat, in sickness and health, under a canopy of stars and under the assault of flying stones. He gave away everything he had. He surrendered every honor. He asked only that Christ be glorified, and that the name of Whitefield perish, if need be, for that to happen. What can we take from this life for our own? First, that the new birth is everything. Whitefield did not find God through religious performance. He found God in total weakness and total surrender. It was when he stopped striving and cast himself entirely on the mercy of God through Christ that the light broke in. And that experience, real, living, transforming encounter with the Holy Spirit, was the foundation of every sermon he ever preached and every sacrifice he ever made. Without the new birth, there is no life. Without real encounter with God, religion is just noise. Second, that God uses the broken. Whitefield's body was weak his entire adult life. He vomited blood. He strained his voice. He battled illness repeatedly. And yet the weaker his physical frame became, the more clearly the power of God operated through him. The pattern of his life was the pattern of the cross itself. Strength through weakness, glory through suffering, life through death. Third, that humility is the rarest and most powerful force in God's kingdom. A man who voluntarily surrendered the greatest ministry in the English-speaking world so that someone else could lead, and asked only that his own name might perish in the process, is not a man whose name history can afford to forget. Heaven remembers. And we must too. And fourth, perhaps most urgently for those of us who are watching and listening today, that fire spreads. Whitefield lit fires in the hearts of men, women, and children that lasted for generations. The revival he carried did not end when he died. It became the soul of a new nation. It produced hymns that are still sung. It built schools and colleges and hospitals. It reached into slave quarters and mining camps and royal drawing rooms with the same gospel, the same power, the same Christ. That fire is still available. That same spirit that came upon a young man lying on a sickbed in Oxford, too weak to pray, too broken to try anymore, is the same spirit moving in the earth right now, looking for men and women who are willing to burn. The question George Whitefield's life asks every single one of us is simply this: are you willing to be poured out? If the life of George Whitefield has moved you, challenged you, or drawn you closer to the God who lit him on fire, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every share carries this fire a little further. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of a man or woman whom God consumed for his glory. We tell these stories because the church needs to remember her heroes, not to worship them, but to be reminded of what is possible when a human being says yes to God with everything they have. And we would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where in the world you are watching from, and tell us if you caught the A.W. Tozer story on this channel too. We are building a family of believers who refuse to be lukewarm, and we are so glad you are here.